because the United States seems to be in relative decline, is so obsessed with its own internal strife, doesn't want to play global leader and policeman, therefore China thinks that you don't need to hide anything, this is China's time, and China thinks, let's take our claim to global leadership? Is that what's at play in your view?
Just because the United States under President Trump is a mess doesn't mean that China's actions are entirely derivative of that, right? Xi Jinping's China is not Deng Xiaoping's China. And some states, when they're under international pressure, change to pursue more conciliatory pathways. But China's not that way. It's a vicious counterpuncher. And when it feels it's under pressure, often it lashes out in ways that are a little unpredictable. In the run-up to 1962, China was worried that states might engage in predation because of the Great Leap Forward and how much of a mess China had made for itself at home. Now, Xi Jinping, despite the COVID pandemic having started in China, appears to have largely righted the ship there. We don't have a full sense of the COVID pandemic there, but it appears that it's less serious than many other places in the world. But it is the case that China feels under pressure, and nevertheless, it's engaging in nibbling actions all around its borders, largely because it can get away with it. China's had the largest expansion of power among any states in 50, if not 100 years. The Chinese economic miracle has translated into improvements in the People's Liberation Army, and it's difficult for any of these states that are suffering from Chinese salami slicing to escalate because that escalation is so unpredictable.
Professor Vipin Narang, if this had happened in the middle of the 21st century, by then it's possible that China may have actually developed the economic and the military capability to genuinely be considered the world's most powerful economy and military. Is this 30 years too soon? Do you believe that China is pushing too far ahead too soon without really having what it takes to be the leader of the world?
I mean, this tends to be the folly of rising powers. They tend to pick fights before they're ready. But I think three things have happened at this moment that have led China to behave, as Professor Clary said, as a vicious counterpuncher. And we shouldn't search for monocausal explanations for Chinese behavior. What's happened this year? One, there's been the COVID crisis at home. We don't know what Xi Jinping's domestic legitimacy looks like. And there's certainly a lot of international pressure because the pandemic originated in China. Number two, although the United States may be in decline, he has a real opportunity with President Trump right now because he knows President Trump, may tweet aggression against China, but he won't actually do anything in an election year. And so there is this opportunism at this particular moment, if there are the combination of domestic legitimacy concerns plus the reality that the U.S. won't militarily respond to China, especially in its periphery. And the third thing is, on this issue of Article 370, I don't think it's a cause, but I think it's a convenient justification for China. And they will use it to justify what looks like, as Jeff said, an unprecedented page out of this playbook where they push on an entire swath of the eastern sector, of the western sector of the line of actual control and build up and salami slice with these attempted fait accomplis and really have the Indian army and government on its heels, because there's no reason for the Indian government to have expected China to behave this way in the midst of a pandemic.
So we've dealt with what could potentially have been the trigger. China is a notoriously non-transparent nation, and therefore beyond a point you really don't know what the dragon's thinking. But what we do need to spend the next few minutes on is India's response matrix and which of those levers should India be pressing. Should there be a military pushback? Should we say this is not a fight worth getting into at this time? Figure out economic options, build your own domestic economic and military capacities. Which way should we go? Let me put that question first to Nitin Pai.
See, I've long said that India's best foreign policy is 8% economic growth. If we have sustained economic growth, we will be able to accumulate economic power and translate that into military power, which we can bring to bear on many of these issues. But economic power works in the long term, and we don't have the luxury of waiting that long. In fact, Nehru also thought the same thing. One of his first responses to the 1959 provocations was that, look, we shouldn't be fighting a war now, let's develop our economy, develop economic strength, and then we'll be able to take them on at a future date. And we've been saying that all this way from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and until now. and China seems to have grown relatively in economic power compared to us. So while 8% economic growth is a long-term policy that we need to follow, we need answers in the short term. We need answers in the here and the now, such that we don't get into the salami slicing situation, which has been happening for the last several
So what are your
decades.
here and now answers to this question?
I think the easiest here and now answer is to take the fight into the South China Sea. The argument is simply this, that we will mess with you in the South China Sea if you mess with us on the Himalayan borders. And you know, messing with them in the South China Sea is pretty easy, because in the South China Sea, China is up against the United States, Vietnam, Australia, Japan, and many of the Southeast Asian countries. And one additional Indian naval ship there can be noticed by Beijing as a signal that we are ready to mess with them where it matters to them.